first time ever, Waterford had to share the harbour with a rival port. Objections to New Ross by the men of Waterford fell on deaf ears. As King John lay dying, he made matters worse by putting Marshal in charge of England until King John's son was old enough to rule. In this powerful position, Marshal ordered that ships could ply through the lands of William Marshal, the King's guardian, thus bypassing Waterford for New Ross. It was only when the aging Marshal retired to a life of religious devotion as a Templar knight that this city's complaints were listened to. The new King Henry III recognised the challenge to his royal port and the income he got from it. He ordered that all ships entering Waterford harbour must unload at Waterford. But following objections from Marshal's son and successor in 1222, the king came up with a compromise. He allowed ships coming from the Marshal lands to go freely to New Ross, but all other ships must touch at Waterford. The king also ordered Waterford to build 3 ships for the defence of the realm. To this day, they are emblazoned on this city's coat of arms. It was very difficult for the Waterford merchants to prove that ships bypassing Waterford and going to New Ross had not come from Marshal lands. Wine was the most popular drink in Ireland, and Waterford was one of the few ports allowed by law to import it. It was here that the king's wine tax was collected. Merchants trying to evade paying this tax began smuggling wine to New Ross. To make smuggling wine to New Ross less attractive, King Henry III issued this charter to Waterford in 1232, generously granting the city the right to charge only half the normal royal tax on wine. Bitterness continued between the two ports. The king might well make a law, but enforcing it was a different matter. His governors were constantly sending sheriffs to New Ross to search for wine ships and confiscate their cargoes if they had bypassed Waterford. In 1266, Waterford merchants took the law into their own hands and went downriver, forcing ships to unload at Waterford. This led to open warfare, and in one battle, 2 men were killed. The king ordered a tribunal, and Judge Alexander of Nottingham was sent from England. Here we have the names of the witnesses who testified to this piracy of the merchants of New Ross. The very next year, the king's governor, David de Barry, was ordered to New Ross to take for the king's use the goods of any ship that had bypassed Waterford illegally. Despite this, New Ross was thriving. They were so puffed up with pride that they decided to make a city of their town. They walled in an area of land so big it rivaled in size both Waterford and Dublin. The walling of New Ross is celebrated in a poem preserved in this ancient volume that came into our hands when His Majesty King Henry VIII closed the Franciscan friary here. Here we are. On Sunday, the fair ladies of New Ross go, and in truth they do good work. Never in any land where I have been did I see so many fair ladies in a foss. Fair ladies indeed. If only their men had been as fair. Good King Henry III died in 1272, and his son, the great warrior, became King Edward I. Ambitious to conquer Scotland, Edward borrowed heavily from Italian merchant bankers to pay his army. To repay the Italian bankers, in 1275 he introduced a new tax on England and Ireland's exports of wool and hides. The Italian bankers collected the tax in the designated English and Irish ports, including Waterford and Ross. Now more than ever, Waterford wanted to hold the line on its monopoly of the wine, because the ships importing wine returned home with wool and hides. In 1275, the very year the wool tax was introduced, Governor Geoffrey de Joinville ordered the Sheriff of Dublin to take for the king both ship and cargo of any mariner who landed in New Ross and had not come from the Marshal lands. This was repeated twice under Governor Robert de Ufford in 1277. In 1281, when Waterford city was at the very height of its prosperity, it was burnt down. Some say by accident, others by the men of New Ross, who put lighted torches into the cellars of merchants. In 1292, when the wine ship the Alice from Harwich was arrested for illegally entering the port of Ross, the men of that town demanded an inquiry into Waterford's monopoly on wine. The inquiry found in Waterford's favour. In reaction, the Lord of Ross offered to collect the wine tax in Ross and pay it to the king, but Edward I rejected this, thus securing the prosperity of his royal port of Waterford. The now familiar order to stop ships bypassing Waterford for New Ross continued to ring out across the Irish Sea. In 1348, a cargo that nobody wanted entered the Irish ports. The Black Death. The plague wiped out over a third of our citizens. Misfortune followed misfortune for Waterford until King Edward III issued this charter in 1356, stating that all ships, with no exceptions entering the harbour, must unload at Waterford. This was a great victory for the royal port of Waterford, but the celebrations did not last long. 5 years later, the city suffered a humiliating defeat when it was attacked by the combined forces of the powers of County Waterford and the O'Driscolls of County Cork. 36 chief citizens and 60 foreign merchants were killed along with the mayor, John Malpas. The new mayor wrote to the king about the city's dire situation, and the king confirmed the 1356 charter. This was reconfirmed in 1371 by Governor William of Windsor. New Ross lodged yet another objection. This was not the first inquiry that the men of Waterford had to face, but it would be the last. They fought back not with a sword, but with a pen. So in 1372, the city officials searched their archive for documents and compiled this great charter roll by stitching them all together. Then they did something unprecedented. They decorated the roll with images to flatter the king, and to prove to him the long, unbroken line of support for Waterford by all the kings and their governors, stretching back 6 generations to King Henry II in 1171. Mayor Lombard brought the charter roll to London, where he presented it to King Edward III. The roll achieved its objective. Waterford's claim to be the premier port in the harbour was upheld, although the bitter antagonism dragged on for another 150 years. The port of Waterford had won the day. I well recall the last great battle between the men of New Ross and the men of Waterford on the 20th of May in the year of our Lord, 1518. I am proud to say that my kinsman, James Wise, was one of the 34 citizens of Waterford who, under the command of the mayor, had a resounding victory. The men of New Ross complained that the men of Waterford led the attack together with French, Spanish, Breton and Irish mercenaries. They were dressed in surcoats, coats of mail, helmets with shields, spears, swords, lances, crossbows, bows, arrows, broad axes and cannon. New Ross was forced to pay Waterford a fine of £100 in silver and to deliver unto us a trophy of our victory, the New Ross mace valued at £20. It was I, Sir William Wise, who 10 years later, in 1528, finally ended this 300-year-long dispute when I was this city's ambassador to the royal court. I reminded my boyhood friend, King Henry VIII, that his father, Henry VII, had called Waterford Urbs Intacta Manet, the untaken city, because it had never fallen into the hands of the king's enemies. His Majesty, understanding full well our loyalty, ordered his advisor, Sir Thomas More, and the great Cardinal Wolsey, the Chancellor, to ensure that Waterford's position as premier port in the harbour was never again challenged. Ever since the Anglo-Normans, or English, came to Ireland, the merchants of this city relied on international trade and the protection of the king and his courts when doing business. We have always been loyal to whoever sat on the throne of England. Our business is overseas trade. Politics is for us. Arbs intacta manet Waterfordi, or as you might say, Waterford, the untaken city.